welcome to Dojo Live this Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. I am your host, Kim Lantis, and of course, joining me is the most important person today, our guest, Sara T. There she is. I was like, where'd she go? Perfect. It's just us today, Sara. Two girls, co-hosts are taking the day off. So it's great to have you. Looking forward so much to our conversation today here about tipping for what? We're going to be addressing the tipping paradigm shift. But before we do, Sara, let me see if I can get this. Taveprungsenukul. That's right? We're close?
Great job, Kim.
All right. But folks, I have Sara's permission to introduce her as Sara T, founder and CEO of Merci-Buku. Love the name of your business, the cashless. I love it. Merci-Buku is a very well-known way of saying thank you, and it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's very exciting.
It is. It's going to be a super fun conversation. So before we dive in, however, we'd like to get to know the Sara T story. I'm under the impression that hospitality is in your blood.
Yes. So many of us have grown up in hospitality, yourself as well. But I feel like I was actually birthed into it. My very entrepreneurial parents had a family restaurant that I grew up in, working in, and that's where I really first developed my passion for hospitality. So my two big passions are hospitality and technology, but for hospitality, it really started there. And it's really interesting how we come full circle because tips was a really big reason for me in developing that passion, because I really enjoyed serving others and creating memorable experiences. But the tips, was like validation, knowing that I helped contribute to that great experience and I'm being rewarded with the tip, and just having that continual loop of acknowledgement and instant gratification.
Oh, I have to say I've worked in food service, and there was the occasional moment where you're like, come on now. I know I did way better than the tip that you left me.
Yeah, for sure. And it's always interesting, right? Where you're like, you don't judge a book by its cover, right? Because you may think that person or group or, family or whatever may not leave you a great tip, and then they end up leaving you a really amazing one, or vice versa.
Exactly. So this is great. I love it. Birthed into hospitality, particularly food service industry.
Yes.
But we know that last week was the International Housekeeping Appreciation Week. And I understand that that's mostly what Merci-Buku is about. So what was the shift from sort of food service to housekeeping?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked, because I had to rack my brain and take a trip down memory lane to think about this too today. So I actually went to hospitality school. I went to the University of Central Florida in Orlando for hospitality, where I had a focus on food and beverage management. And so, during college, you have some more time. And so I got a job at Chipotle at that time. Like Chipotle was really like, popular and stuff. But that's when I found out that QSRs, no knock to quick service restaurant professionals out there, but it wasn't for me. And I had joined the HSMEI, Hospitality Sales and Marketing Association International student chapter at UCF. And they would take the students on these field trips for different hospitality venues, like, hotels and stuff. And so we did one at the Gaylord Palms there in Kissimmee one time. I'll never forget it. Mike Mason, who was the VP of Sales and Marketing there at the time. And if you've ever been to a Gaylord hotel, in Florida, they have one in Texas, DC. They just opened one in Denver, and they're opening one in Chula Vista. But they're amazing. They just have all these glass floor to ceiling atriums and just beautiful, beautiful properties, right? So I immediately fell in love there. I was like, I'll scrub toilets here, But anyway, so Mike Mason said, yeah, and if any of you guys are, wanting a job or interested in internships and stuff, drop off your resume. And so I did that, and I joined, Gaylord Palms, and it was basically my shift to my love for hotels.
I love it.
And through, at Gaylor Palms, I worked in various roles in rooms, hotel rooms operations. I was a rooms control agent, well, front desk agent, but then I was a rooms control agent where I interacted with the housekeeping department and engineering and others to get the, rooms ready for this 1,406 room hotel. So that was a really great, exposure into it. And then I loved the culture at Gaylor Palms so much because it really fit with my, views on service. One of their sayings was that we're called co-stars, and cast
Oh yeah.
we were called co-stars. And our goal was to ensure memorable stays by making guests feel welcome, comfortable, and important. And I love that because it was very much in line with how I grew up in my ideals of service. But the technology piece, where I, really got exposed to technology and my passion for it was also through hotels, for working in hotels.
All right. And enter tipping. Tipping is a big part of food service, maybe not QSR. Today it kind of is. And housekeeping. But let's lean then into Merci-Buku, how your cashless tipping app works. And more importantly, let's talk about what we're tipping for and addressing sort of this paradigm shift in the tipping universe. What's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first with Merci-Buku, Merci-Buku came out of COVID actually, because, everyone woke up and immediately knew how to scan a QR code. If you were, or 100, you knew, right? Everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. And the push for or the movement of mobile payments was becoming more and more prevalent too. It's much more prevalent in other countries, but especially during COVID with the contactless payments, deliveries, things like that, everything was really done payment-wise via mobile. And also the safety piece, right, of folks not wanting to handle cash or carrying cash. And there was this big movement with tips in restaurants of because banks were closed, brick and mortar banks were closed, restaurateurs had a hard time even getting access to the cash to be able to tip out, because most transactions now at restaurants anyway are done via credit card. Tips are added to that. And so cash is really non-existent. But as far as focusing tipping in hospitality in hotels where we are, there's been a need for it way before COVID. I remember frequenting to Vegas and the casinos where I was tipping the valet with chips, casino chips, because I had used all my cash. I didn't have any cash. And God forbid if I lost that day and I didn't have anything to tip them with, right? But anyway, it's been an issue for a while because we have, as a society, have moved so much towards cashless and more convenient ways of transacting money and tips and stuff. So that's really where Merci-Buku birthed out of. But to be honest, when I first started, I didn't think that housekeeping is our number one use case. When most hospitality organizations come to us, the number one thing they'd like to implement this in is housekeeping. Now, of course, there's other departments, that would benefit from tipping as well, cashless tipping as well. And that's what I thought. I thought initially it would need more like valet parking attendants, bell services, concierge, tour guides. That's what I was thinking. But housekeeping was the number one. And I think a lot of it has to do with the labor shortage and having a hard time finding, talent specifically in housekeeping. We're seeing more and more third-party contract labor companies because of it. And so businesses were really trying to find a way to motivate and incentivize and make their workplace more attractive by adding the benefits of cashless tipping.
What are the benefits of cashless tipping then for a housekeeper?
Yeah. Well, for a housekeeper, the benefits is that, before guests would leave, if they were going to leave a tip, and if they had the cash, they would leave it, in the room, maybe on the nightstand, or before, I don't really see them as much anymore. There used to be like envelopes, with a housekeeper's name and something, and you can put it in there. But more and more, again, since people don't carry cash, they're not doing that, right? So we're seeing a huge drop, even again before COVID, with housekeepers not getting as many tips anymore.
Right. Or I suppose too, even like if you're there for a longer stay and there's more than one individual who's cleaned your room throughout the time you're there, just the last person. I mean, it comes down to an honor system. I mean, I would want to think that as teammates and team members, they would say, hey, here's your cut. But there's nothing necessarily to stop the last person to do the final clean to pocket that tip all for themselves.
Right, absolutely. So for the benefit also for housekeepers and for all service people that utilize cashless tipping is that it's a more secure way of transacting that tip, right? So like, let's say that you were staying at a hotel in Wyoming and you and your family stayed there for 2 nights and you wanted to leave $20 for the housekeeping room attendant, just to thank them for the service. That $20 is held. It's not just like a tangible piece of, a $20 bill that's sitting there that, finders keepers or whatever. It's there being held for the correct individual to be, pushed to.
I love that. I wanted to talk about this idea. You chose to talk about tipping for what? And I think we talked about this, alluded to this a bit earlier in the show with QSRs. And so it seems to me when it comes to tipping, and this is speaking from my personal experience, I've come through 2 different struggles. I mean, number one, I enjoy tipping, particularly because I myself have worked in food service. I know what that means. With that, I do expect a quality of service. So there's this idea of I'm not always going to be like, oh, default 20% or whatever. Like I do decide based on the service that I receive, but I'm always going to tip, even if it's bad. My husband's like, why? And it's funny because there's the American culture of tipping, and I'm married to a man from Mexico. And so Mexican tipping culture is different. So that's one thing. But also, I think I've also struggled with the, oh no, like I would like so much to give you something, but I honestly have nothing on me. And then you feel like this like jerk cheapskate. So that's one thing. And then I think also is just, let's take QSR examples. I don't tip when I go to QSRs generally. To me, there needs to be some type of service exchange. Also, for me, there's this knowledge that I know that the person who's working behind the counter at a QSR is different than the person who's serving in terms of pay by the hour and whatever, than the person who's waiting at my table in a sit-down restaurant. So what does this look like? What is this paradigm shift? What are we tipping for? What's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to address it and make a point in addressing it as a society now, because it has gotten out of hand. And you're right, it is a very cultural thing here, but it doesn't have to be. And I've done a lot of research in like other parts of the country and their views and stuff on tipping, but there's one consistent thing that I think that I can see globally that we all can agree on is that traditional tipping is for good service. It's a true key performance indicator for a positive guest experience. So when technology comes into play of like, technology already had started to influence this paradigm shift. Like if you remember when people started paying more digitally or paying more with cards versus cash, you would see on the printout checks, it would be suggested tip, right? 15, 20% suggested tip, or 15, 18, whatever.
I always appreciate it when the math is done for me.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. It was nice, right? But it was already like starting to instill in our culture that that's like the norm, that you should, that you should tip, not how you feel, but which is great. Like I like knowing that too. But then once these point of sale systems started having that feature in there, it was like prevalent. Everybody, anytime you're transacting any kind of anything, right, there's the option to tip now. And unfortunately, that really skews the KPIs for tipping for the positive experience, because now you have guilt tipping. You have people that are, you know, feel awkward or feel shame or pressure into doing it. And this whole weird, if you think about it, it's weird because it's like you mentioned the QSR. It's like tip now, service later.
Yeah. Like,
Right?
I don't even know if I'm going to be happy.
Yeah. You don't know what that food tastes like. You don't know if it's going to be great. You don't know if you're going to wait 40 minutes for that. Like, why are you, you know, it's just, it's weird. And it's a paradigm shift that was heavily influenced because of technology, because of the way that technology has done that. So with Merci-Buku, it was, even though we are a tipping company, it was important for me that that wasn't part of it, because I grew up in the industry. You grew up learning that we earn those tips, right?
Right.
And it's an indicator of how it's at the discretion of the guest, of the customer, on how they felt that experience was. Did I earn that, you know, that tip? And so now I feel like we've shifted as a society with this paradigm shift to teaching people that they should expect those tips, because they're just, you know.
And I wonder if there's in your research, if you found, then has tipping gone up, gone down? Has it stayed the same? Because has there been this pendulum shift of like, wow, I'm being asked to tip everywhere, I'm not going to tip anywhere?
Yeah.
Is there that negative impact on?
Not enough yet, because there's still a lot of people like yourself that always will always. I've heard all kinds of things like, oh, well, I'm scared they're gonna like spit in my coffee or this. But you know what's bad about this is, because it is expected, right? It has gone up, right? But there are still many businesses that are using it as a way to supplement the income that they're or, you know, the wages. So instead of increasing the wages, the tips that are coming in from guests and paying customers are helping to supplement for that.
Right. And I can see there's just so many angles and so many factors, because then it's like, well, then because I'm having to tip more, than going out to eat or doing whatever I'm wanting to do becomes less frequent because it's costing me more. And then I think it might create this cycle, this chicken and the egg catch 22, dang if you do, darn if you don't kind of thing. But I think it's interesting because you mentioned that a lot of this shift, or this problem space that we find ourselves in with tipping, is technology's fault. Enter technology to correct the course as well. So, how are you using this tech to make the tipping paradigm where we want it to be?
Yeah, well, I can speak for hotels. I've thought about it a little bit for like the QSR use case, but you know, for hotels, for our industry, you think about the different areas, right? Housekeeping, valet, bell, you know, spa, open bars with banquets and stuff like that. There's so many areas in hospitality and in hotels that have tipping, right? And then when you look at the way traditional tipping happened in those areas, like, okay, you bring around your car from valet, and then, you know, you give them a tip right there. Like, very seldomly do you see people tipping, you know, before, like when they first bring the cars, more after, right? Same thing with bellman. Usually it's when the luggage is delivered or the assistance is helped, you know, taking the deliver on the checkout. And then there's a cash tip, right? That's handed there. With housekeeping, it's usually not handed. It's usually, you know, left there in the room. So we look at those things and we say, okay, how can we emulate that in a digital way, in a way that's going to be both convenient for the guest and for the employees, right? Appreciated by the employees. So the different things that we have to make sure that we're doing, just like we did with cash, is how are we accepting those tips, right? How are we ensuring that it's going to the right people? Because of different, you know, maybe it's a tip pool, or it's, you know, the specific housekeeper. And then how are those tips being pushed back to the recipients, to the employees? So with Merci-Buku, what we did for housekeeping tips is we work with having some nice signage so that the guests know that this convenience is even available for them to do, right? Some nice signage, and it could be something that's like, on the nightstand or on the back of the door or something like that, that lets guests know that. It usually has a QR code right there that the guest can scan and then leave the tip from their mobile device, right? But the great thing about that is nobody's there standing in front of the guests to ensure, that they're going to do this. It's really organic and based on how clean and comfortable that guest felt to leave that tip.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I like the QR code component because I don't actively have to download an app or do anything. It doesn't cost me as a guest anything other than essentially taking a picture and touching a few buttons, and I'm done. I love it. And so, the guest experience is good. I think there's discretionary. It makes me feel, I suppose, more free to express how I really felt about the service and the variety of services at the hotels. My assumption is that the employees are seeing an increase in their tips with organizations that are using cashless tipping like Merci-Buku. What's it mean for the organizations as well? I understand that on the back end, there's also some types of, aside, we already touched on this, I think, a bit about labor shortages and just happier employees. And I'm assuming increased tenure, maybe even word of mouth so that, other people come and work for you rather than the hotel across the street. But what else can you do in terms of technology? Is there any sort of data analytics component to this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's lots that you can tell from the data there, and also we collect feedback and ratings as well, so guests can leave that information. But if you think about your resume or your credentials and stuff like that, the tips that come in for individuals is really a good indicator of that too. So you could look at, okay, who are your employees that are performing the best in quality assurance checks, in tips, because that's a really good indicator, right? Is if the guests are acknowledging that. We can also look at trends like, since housekeeping is more of a it's not necessarily like in person, right? And service in person. So if it's based on how clean and comfortable the guest felt in that room, that also relates to the quality of the room too, right? Maybe some things that are out of the hands of control for housekeeping, like maintenance related stuff or whatever. So we've seen some trends where rooms that are renovated or rooms that are hotels that are newer get more tips than others. Yeah. So that's really interesting too. And then
that
also
makes sense, because as a waitress, do we even say that word anymore? We don't. Server. I haven't waited for 20 years now. So. But I remember if a guest wasn't satisfied with the food, you would get that dinged out of your tip, even though your service as a server was great. I'm not the one who cooked it. I'm sorry. But it makes sense. So it's like, oh, this food was great. The server gets a higher tip. The room is impeccable. The housekeeping gets a higher tip.
Right. But then if you think about it, it kind of is, it will encourage housekeeping to also take more interest in helping to keep that room in tip-top shape. Report maintenance issues if you see anything wrong with it. If those towels are a little scraggly, let's go get some different ones that are not.
Yep. Yeah, and is there space too, like, even if the housekeeper doesn't report the faucet's leaky or just not leaking when they happen to be there or whatever, and the guest happens to just write that, like, are you also seeing this increase in the guest side of putting forward this type of information?
Yes, we are. And it's really interesting. And I think that it's all about the convenience, right? Because guests can leave tips through our platform in like 3 to 5 seconds. A lot of them also use like Apple Pay and Google Pay, which is so easy, right? And so then when they're prompted with, if you'd like to leave, again, optional, if you want to leave a rating and some feedback, you can. So if you're met at the transaction, this is really what we're seeing too. If you're met at that transaction at that time, and you're not burdening the guests with having to go back and remember, a couple days later on a survey what this was, you're really able to get some good information right then and there because it's fresh on their mind and in the moment.
It makes a lot of sense because as I'm walking out the door or standing on the curb waiting for my, shuttle to take me to the airport or whatever, like I get that. I'm going to be much more likely to be I'm here. Why not?
Yeah,
versus
reflecting
4 days later and I get an email that lands in my inbox. Share your experience with us. I'm like, I'm working. Leave me alone. And I'll ignore it. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. So we've talked a lot about, I think, what it means for staff themselves, what it also means for the operation. Are there any sort of final words that you'd like to bring in terms of this paradigm shift, cashless tipping, as it relates to hospitality, or what's next? How would you kind of like to end today's conversation?
Well, if cashless tipping, digital tipping, they're kind of synonymous, but we've seen a real popularity in hospitality for it in the past couple of years, especially after COVID, of brands, organizations, unions all adopting it. So if I feel like the education's already there, people really know about it. But if you are listening and you haven't implemented yet, I definitely encourage you to consider it because coming off of Housekeeping Appreciation Week, International Housekeeping Appreciation Week last week, it was great to see on social all of these different organizations recognizing and celebrating their housekeeping teams, the heart of the house that works so hard, But with cashless tipping, it would be a great way for us to appreciate or enable guests to appreciate and show their appreciation for housekeeping and all service staff all the time, every day.
Yeah, 51 weeks, the other 51 weeks out of the year. That's lovely. That's beautiful. As we close today, I wanted to bring it back to the Sara T story. You as an entrepreneur in the industry, what has this adventure been like for you? I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. What has this adventure been like for you? And are there any other tip that you'd like to provide for folks like yourselves who are setting out on these adventures? What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? And what's next in the Sara T story?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I definitely think that passion fuels everything. So being able to recognize what my passions were early on, and leaning into them, leaning into, my resources and to like HSMAI, for example, and kind of knowing where you might want to go with those passions.
I love it. And to have a family and others who support you. I know you mentioned your parents, you mentioned what was his name? Of the hotel who supported you and brought you right in, and if you needed a job.
Oh yeah, Mike Mason was the VP of Sales and Marketing. Yeah, at that time.
Yeah. Are you also involved in the new generation of hospitality? Do you support those young folks, or what might we say to increase the interest in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I love the industry so much, and I want to see more growth in it. Right? I'd love to see more people want to go to school and learn more about it and get in because it's such a great industry. So, and there's, as you can see, just in my story alone, there's so many avenues that it could take you. Right? And so I, would love to contribute through mentorship or through joining other associations in any way that I can help that way, but I'm constantly trying to incorporate into my business and the products that we have a way for us to sustain the hospitality industry that way too.
For sure. And I think even just embracing the technology side of it and continuing that merger and that marriage of technology with hospitality is also just what the younger generation is about, right? I know it's what we do now every day in our personal lives via our phones and everywhere else. And so it's expected, I think, when you come in as an employee to be doing things in that fast sort of technical way. So I think that's an amazing contribution as well. Sarah, if people want to get a hold of you to speak with you about the technology you've built, cashless cooking in general, and of course what Merci-Buku is all about and what it might do for their hotels, how might they go about doing?
Yes, they can go to our website at Merci, MERCI hyphen Buku, BUKU.com.
I love it. Perfect. And of course, LinkedIn there to catch you and speak to you as well. Sarah, it has been a pleasure learning your story, learning all about what you're doing with cashless tipping and for the employees as well as for the hotels. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Stick around for just a minute as we go off air. But before we do, I would like to remind our audience that we've got no other show this week, but we do have a absolutely full week next week. So be sure to catch us on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific. We're going to be kicking it off with a Fixify and excuse me, on Tuesday, Tuesday the 24th, with Stephanie Trussell, who is the COO, and they're all about helping hotels find the right technology to find technology. Yes, reducing friction in the purchasing of technology for hotels. So catch us then. And for now, stay well and stay safe, everyone. Thank you again, Sarah.